Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The arrival at the terminal. The private terminal exuded luxury, gleaming marble floors, glass walls overlooking the runway, and attendants dressed immaculately, projecting an air of exclusivity. For many, this was a sanctuary of privilege, a world where time moved slower, and convenience reigned supreme. For Ophelia Harris, it was just another stop on her journey home. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer and tailored trousers, her presence was commanding yet understated. At 62, Ophelia carried herself with the poise of someone who had fought for every inch of her success. Her pearl earrings caught the sunlight streaming through the terminal's massive windows, a small yet significant nod to the elegance she had cultivated over decades of hard work. Ophelia was no stranger to the subtle challenges she often faced as a black woman navigating elite spaces. She had built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire from the ground up, defying odds, stereotypes, and systemic hurdles. Earlier that day, she had delivered the keynote speech at an international business summit, addressing a room filled with the world's most influential leaders. Her speech had been met with a standing ovation, a testament to her expertise and resilience. As she approached the counter with her flight details, she noticed the attendant's gaze, cool, assessing, and dismissive. The man, in his late 30s, barely glanced at her as he tapped on the keyboard. "Good morning," Ophelia began, her tone warm yet professional. "I'm here to board my flight. The jet is parked on the tarmac, and I have my documentation ready." The attendant barely looked up. "Name?" he asked curtly. "Ophelia Harris." She handed over her ID and boarding credentials, maintaining her composure. The man scanned the documents, his brows furrowing slightly. His lips tightened as he glanced at her, then back at the screen. "I don't see your name listed here as a passenger," he said flatly. "That's because I'm not a passenger," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm the owner of the jet." The attendant paused, his skepticism evident. He looked at her again, this time with a faint smirk of disbelief. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'll need to verify that. Please step aside while I check with the flight crew." Ophelia felt the familiar sting of being doubted, dismissed, and disrespected. She watched as the attendant walked over to a group of flight crew members, gesturing toward her. Their brief discussion was punctuated by glances in her direction, followed by laughter that, while subdued, was unmistakable. Moments later, a middle-aged crew member, wearing the uniform of authority, approached her. His demeanor was brusque, his tone condescending. "Ma'am, we've been informed there's some confusion." "Are you sure you're at the right terminal?" he asked, his voice dripping with doubt. Ophelia took a deep breath, reminding herself of the battle she had won before. "I am certain," she said, meeting his gaze. "I own that jet. I need to board now. My credentials are in order, and there should be no confusion." But the man wasn't convinced. "I'm sorry, but we need further verification. This terminal is for private jet owners and their guests." "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" The insinuation hit hard. Ophelia felt the eyes of other passengers and staff on her, their whispers buzzing in the background like static. The humiliation was palpable, but she refused to let it show. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said, her tone unyielding. The crew member hesitated, his confidence faltering slightly under her steady gaze. "That won't be necessary, ma'am. I'll double-check with the pilot, but these things take time." Ophelia's patience was wearing thin. She glanced at her watch. 10 minutes had already passed, and this ordeal was far from over. She thought of the countless hours she had spent proving herself in boardrooms, the late nights building her company, and the sacrifices she had made. This was not just about boarding a plane, it was about principle, about confronting the prejudice that had followed her throughout her life. As the crew member walked away, Ophelia stood alone, the weight of the moment pressing on her. She adjusted her pearl earrings, a gesture that had become her anchor in moments of adversity. Her resolve hardened. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. Across the terminal, she noticed a young woman, likely in her 20s, watching the scene unfold. The woman's expression was one of quiet admiration mixed with concern. Ophelia held her gaze for a moment, offering a faint but reassuring smile. In that moment, Ophelia made a decision. She wasn't going to let this incident end quietly. Whatever happened next, she would ensure it became a lesson, not just for those who doubted her, but for anyone who had ever faced similar struggles. As the minutes ticked by, the crew returned, their expressions a mix of discomfort and defiance. What happened next would send shockwaves through the terminal, leaving everyone in awe of the quiet power of standing firm against prejudice. Ophelia Harris stood firm in the center of the terminal, the polished marble beneath her feet as cold as the reception she had received. Her mind raced through the countless times she had faced this kind of dismissal, yet each time, she had risen above it. This moment would be no different. As the minutes dragged on, she felt the weight of the onlookers' stares, their curiosity and judgment palpable in the air. She wasn't merely waiting for an apology or acknowledgement, she was preparing to teach a lesson no one in this terminal would forget. The crew member returned, his posture stiffer than before, his tone attempting to mask irritation with a veneer of professionalism. "Ma'am, the pilot has requested additional confirmation of ownership before we proceed. We appreciate your patience during this process." Ophelia's gaze didn't waver. "Additional confirmation? Are you asking every jet owner here for this so-called confirmation, or is this level of scrutiny reserved for me alone?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the attendant behind the counter, as if seeking silent reinforcement. "It's standard procedure, ma'am," he said finally, though the falter in his voice betrayed him. Ophelia took a step closer, her heels clicking against the marble. "Standard procedure," she repeated, her voice low but sharp. "Interesting. Because I've owned this jet for 6 years, flown out of this terminal numerous times, and never once has my ownership been questioned. So tell me, what's different today?" The man had no answer. His silence was louder than any justification he might have offered. The faint murmur of conversations in the terminal grew quieter as more travelers tuned into the unfolding scene. Ophelia could feel the weight of their attention, but she wasn't fazed. She had faced far greater crowds in far more hostile environments. With deliberate calm, she reached into her sleek leather handbag and retrieved her phone. She tapped a few buttons, her fingers steady, and held the phone to her ear. The crew member's expression shifted to one of uncertainty as he watched her, clearly trying to gauge her next move. "Lawrence," she said when the call connected. Her tone softened slightly, a hint of familiarity slipping through. "I need you to get in touch with the airport's executive management team immediately. There seems to be some confusion here at the terminal regarding the ownership of my aircraft." On the other end, her head of operations responded swiftly. "Understood, Ms. Harris. I'll have it handled within the next 5 minutes. Is everything all right?" Ophelia's lips curved into a tight smile, though there was no humor in it. "Not yet, but it will be. Thank you, Lawrence." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag. Turning her attention back to the crew member, she said, "You have 5 minutes. If this matter isn't resolved by then, I'll ensure the next call comes from your corporate headquarters." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say to counter her. He turned on his heel and hurried back toward the counter, where the attendant was now looking visibly uneasy. The two exchanged hurried whispers, their glances darting toward Ophelia every few seconds. She stood motionless, her expression composed but unyielding. The young woman who had been watching earlier stepped closer, her curiosity and admiration now mingled with a quiet determination. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice hesitant but sincere. "I just wanted to say, you're handling this with so much grace. It's inspiring." Ophelia turned to her, her features softening slightly. "Thank you," she said. "But it shouldn't have to be this way. No one should have to fight this hard just to be treated with basic respect." The young woman nodded, her cheeks flushing. "You're right. And I hope they realize that by the time you're done here." Ophelia offered her a small smile before returning her focus to the counter, where the crew member and attendant were now joined by a third figure, an airport manager, judging by his badge and slightly more formal attire. The manager approached her with an air of strained diplomacy, his expression attempting to convey both authority and apology. "Ms. Harris," he began, his voice measured. "I've been informed of the situation. I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience. There seems to have been a miscommunication." Ophelia held up a hand, cutting him off. "Miscommunication? Let's not sugarcoat it, Mr." She glanced at his badge. "Mr. Carter. What happened here was not a miscommunication. It was prejudice, plain and simple. Your staff saw me, made assumptions, and acted on them without a shred of evidence to support their doubts. That's not an inconvenience, it's an insult." Carter's face reddened, and he nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. And I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff. I assure you this matter will be addressed." Ophelia tilted her head slightly, her expression skeptical. "Addressed how, exactly?" "Because an apology is a start, but it's not a solution. What steps will you take to ensure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone who walks through these doors?" Carter hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "We'll review our policies and provide additional training for our staff to ensure situations like this are handled more appropriately in the future." "Handled more appropriately," Ophelia repeated, her tone sharp. "Try this, teach your staff not to make assumptions based on someone's appearance. Train them to treat every individual who walks through these doors with the same level of respect, regardless of their race, gender, or any other factor." Carter nodded again, his discomfort evident. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Harris. And I promise you, we will take this matter seriously." Before he could say more, the young woman who had spoken to Ophelia earlier stepped forward, her voice steady despite the nervousness in her eyes. "If I may," she said, addressing Carter. "I think it would be even more impactful if Ms. Harris were invited to speak with your team directly. Hearing her story and perspective could make a real difference." Ophelia glanced at the young woman, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before it softened into approval. She turned back to Carter, arching an eyebrow. "Well? What do you think, Mr. Carter? Are you open to real change, or is this just lip service?" Carter blinked, clearly taken aback by the suggestion. "I think that's an excellent idea," he said slowly. "Ms. Harris, would you be willing to meet with our team at your convenience? We'd greatly value your insights." Ophelia considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I'll think about it. But for now, I have a flight to catch." Carter quickly stepped aside, signaling to the crew member to escort her to the jet. As she walked toward the tarmac, the young woman called after her. "Thank you, Ms. Harris. For everything." Ophelia turned, her expression warm. "Don't thank me yet. The real work starts now." When she finally boarded her jet, the familiar comfort of its sleek interior wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. She sank into the plush leather seat and let out a long breath, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. As the engines roared to life and the jet taxied down the runway, she glanced out the window at the terminal, its pristine facade hiding the flaws that had just been exposed. Ophelia Harris had faced yet another battle, but she hadn't just won, she had laid the groundwork for change. And as the jet lifted into the sky, she knew this was only the beginning. As the jet ascended into the clouds, Ophelia Harris stared out the window, her thoughts a mix of reflection and determination. The incident at the terminal was not new, but it had stirred something deep within her. Decades of navigating a world that often underestimated her had taught her resilience, but this time, she felt a shift. This wasn't just about her journey, it was about every person who had been dismissed, disrespected, or doubted because of who they were. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as she leaned back in her seat, letting the tension slowly melt away. The interior of her private jet was a testament to her hard-earned success, cream-colored leather seats, polished walnut accents, and a quiet elegance that mirrored her own style. But Ophelia didn't see these comforts as indulgences. To her, they were milestones, symbols of battles fought and won. She closed her eyes, recalling the moment she decided to purchase the jet. It had been 5 years ago, after yet another grueling trip through commercial airlines where she had been relegated to secondary treatment despite her status. The decision to invest in her own aircraft wasn't just about convenience, it was about reclaiming her time, her dignity, and her autonomy. She had named the jet Sovereign, a reflection of her independence and unshakable spirit. Her phone buzzed on the side table, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up to see a message from Lawrence, her head of operations. Spoke with airport management. They're requesting an official meeting with you to address today's incident. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. Ophelia smiled faintly. She could already imagine the unease rippling through their ranks. The terminal staff had underestimated her once, they wouldn't make that mistake again. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she crafted her reply. Scheduled a meeting. But it won't just be about today. We'll discuss broader changes. Prepare a list of actionable steps they can implement to ensure equity and professionalism moving forward. As she sent the message, a sense of purpose solidified within her. This wasn't about revenge, it was about creating an environment where others wouldn't have to endure the same indignities she had faced. Ophelia's thoughts drifted back to her keynote speech earlier that day. Standing before a crowd of international business leaders, she had spoken about the importance of resilience and innovation in a rapidly changing world. Her words had been met with applause, her insights respected and celebrated. Yet just hours later, she had been reduced to justifying her very presence. The irony wasn't lost on her. A soft chime indicated that the flight attendant was approaching. The young woman, impeccably dressed in the jet's uniform, carried a tray with a glass of sparkling water and a small dish of fruit. "Ms. Harris," she said with a warm smile, setting the tray down. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." "Thank you," Ophelia replied, her tone kind but distracted. The attendant lingered for a moment, then spoke again, her voice hesitant. "I heard about what happened at the terminal. I just want to say, it's inspiring how you handled it. People like you paved the way for the rest of us." Ophelia looked up, meeting the young woman's earnest gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the weight of the words settle. "Thank you," she said finally. "But remember, inspiration means nothing without action. When you're in a position to make a difference, take it. Speak up. Stand firm. That's how we pave the way." The attendant nodded, her eyes shining with admiration, before retreating to the galley. Ophelia returned to her thoughts, but they were interrupted by another buzz from her phone. This time, it was a video message from her granddaughter, Lila. She opened it, and the sight of the bright-eyed 10-year-old filled the screen. "Hi, Grandma." Lila's voice was cheerful and full of energy. "Mom told me you gave a big speech today. I know it was awesome because you're awesome. I can't wait to see you and tell you about my science project. Love you." Ophelia's heart swelled. Lila was one of her greatest motivations. Every step she took, every battle she fought, was for the generations that would come after her. She wanted Lila to grow up in a world where her brilliance would be recognized without question, where her worth wouldn't be diminished by prejudice. As the jet cruised through the skies, Ophelia opened her laptop and began drafting a letter to the airport management team. The words flowed effortlessly, each sentence carrying the weight of her experience and the clarity of her vision. She outlined specific measures they could implement: mandatory bias training for staff, an anonymous reporting system for discriminatory behavior, and regular audits to ensure compliance. But she didn't stop there. She included a personal anecdote from her own journey, how she had faced countless doors slammed in her face, how she had learned to push through barriers, and how she had built an empire despite it all. Her letter wasn't just a call for change, it was a challenge to be better, to do better. By the time she finished, the plane had begun its descent. The city lights sparkled below, a sprawling tapestry of opportunity and ambition. Ophelia saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As the jet touched down and taxied to her private hangar, Ophelia's driver was already waiting. The moment she stepped off the aircraft, the cool evening breeze greeted her, carrying with it the faint hum of distant traffic. "Welcome back, Ms. Harris," the driver said, opening the door of the sleek black sedan. "Thank you, Victor," she replied, settling into the back seat. The ride home was quiet, the city's vibrant energy a stark contrast to the tranquility of her thoughts. By the time she reached her estate, a sprawling property that balanced luxury with warmth, she felt the day's events begin to fade, replaced by the comfort of being home. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of fresh flowers and polished wood welcoming her. In the living room, a fire crackled softly in the hearth. Ophelia sank into her favorite armchair, the weight of the day finally lifting. As she gazed at the flames, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. Curious, she opened it to find an article about her confrontation at the terminal. Someone had recorded the incident, and the video had already gone viral. The headline read, "CEO confronts discrimination at private terminal, a lesson in strength and integrity." Ophelia's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She hadn't anticipated the incident gaining public attention, but as she read through the article and scrolled through the comments, she saw messages of support pouring in from people around the world. Her phone rang, and Lawrence's name appeared on the screen. She answered, and his voice came through, tinged with excitement. "Ms. Harris, have you seen the news? The video from the terminal is everywhere. People are calling it a defining moment." Ophelia sighed, a mix of amusement and exasperation. "I didn't plan for this, Lawrence." "I know," he said. "But it's striking a chord. People are talking about systemic change, about holding institutions accountable. Your response is inspiring a movement." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "Then let's make sure it's more than just talk. Schedule that meeting with the airport management. And reach out to our PR team. I want to use this moment to push for real change." "Will do," Lawrence replied. "And, Ms. Harris?" "Yes?" "Thank you. For always leading with purpose." As the call ended, Ophelia set the phone down and closed her eyes. Today had been a battle, but it had also been a victory. And if the world was watching, she would ensure they saw what true leadership looked like. Tomorrow, she would continue the fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. For the generations to come, for her granddaughter Lila, and for every person who dared to dream of a better world. The morning after the terminal incident, Ophelia Harris awoke to a barrage of notifications. Her phone buzzed incessantly, lighting up with texts, emails, and news alerts. She glanced at the clock, it was barely 6. Sighing, she slipped on her reading glasses and reached for her phone, mentally bracing herself for the flood of information. As expected, the video of her confrontation at the terminal had not only gone viral, but had sparked a heated national conversation. News outlets were dissecting every detail of the exchange, social media platforms were flooded with debates, and Ophelia's inbox was overflowing with messages from strangers sharing their own stories of discrimination. What struck her most were the messages from young professionals who saw her as a beacon of hope, a symbol that success could coexist with resilience in the face of prejudice. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Patrice, a mid-level manager at a logistics company, who wrote about her struggles as one of the few Black women in her industry. Patrice's words were raw and heartfelt, her frustration evident in every sentence. She ended the message with a plea, "Ms. Harris, what you did yesterday reminded me that we can demand better. Please, don't let this moment pass without pushing for real change. We're watching, and we're with you." Ophelia read the message twice, then set her phone down. Patrice's words echoed in her mind as she prepared for the day. She dressed with purpose, opting for a crisp white blouse paired with a charcoal gray suit, an ensemble that radiated authority without ostentation. Her pearl earrings, as always, were the final touch. By the time she arrived at her office, her team was already waiting in the conference room. Lawrence stood at the head of the table, his laptop open and ready for a presentation. Around him were the members of her executive team, their expressions a mix of anticipation and determination. "Good morning, everyone," Ophelia said as she entered, her tone brisk but warm. "I trust you've all seen the news?" There were nods around the table. Lawrence spoke first. "Ms. Harris, the video has created quite a stir. We've received inquiries from several media outlets requesting interviews, and the airport's executive team has confirmed their willingness to meet with you this afternoon." "Good," Ophelia replied. She took a seat and folded her hands on the table. "But this isn't just about responding to the moment. We have an opportunity to address a much larger issue. I want to use this platform to advocate for systemic change, not just at the airport, but across industries." One of her executives, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, leaned forward. "I agree, but how do we ensure this doesn't become a one-time headline? The public's attention span is short, and moments like these can fade quickly." Ophelia nodded. "You're right. That's why we need a strategy that goes beyond the immediate. Lawrence, I want a proposal for a public-private partnership that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion training for service-based industries. We'll use our resources to develop a framework that can be adopted nationally." Lawrence's eyes lit up. "That's ambitious, but doable. I'll get started on it right away." Denise interjected. "We should also consider partnering with organizations already working in this space. There are advocacy groups with the expertise and reach to amplify our efforts." "Excellent point," Ophelia said. "Compile a list of potential partners, and let's start reaching out today." The discussion continued for another hour, with the team brainstorming ideas and refining their approach. By the end of the meeting, they had a clear roadmap for leveraging the momentum of the viral incident to drive meaningful change. Later that afternoon, Ophelia arrived at the airport for her meeting with the executive team. This time, the atmosphere was markedly different. She was greeted by the airport's CEO, a middle-aged man with a carefully neutral expression, and a small group of senior staff members. They escorted her to a private conference room, where refreshments had been laid out in an attempt to convey hospitality. "Ms. Harris," the CEO began, his tone conciliatory. "Let me start by expressing our deepest apologies for what occurred yesterday. It was unacceptable, and we take full responsibility." Ophelia inclined her head slightly but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "We've already begun an internal review and are implementing measures to prevent similar incidents in the future," he added, his voice wavering under her steady gaze. "And what are these measures?" Ophelia asked, her tone calm but firm. "Apologies are a start, but they don't address the root cause of the issue. What specific actions are you taking to ensure your staff is trained to treat every customer with respect, regardless of their appearance?" The CEO hesitated, clearly unprepared for her directness. One of his colleagues, a younger woman who seemed eager to make a good impression, jumped in. "We're considering mandatory sensitivity training and updating our customer service protocols to emphasize inclusivity." "Considering isn't enough," Ophelia replied. "You need to commit. And this training can't just be a one-off event. It needs to be ongoing, integrated into your company culture, and tied to measurable outcomes." The woman nodded, scribbling notes furiously. Ophelia leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "What happened yesterday wasn't just an isolated incident, it's indicative of a systemic problem. If you truly want to be leaders in this industry, you need to set an example. That means transparency, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." The room fell silent for a moment. Then the CEO cleared his throat. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Harris. We're prepared to make these changes, and we'd be honored if you would consult with us to ensure we're on the right track." Ophelia smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "I'm willing to help, but only if I see genuine commitment. Words without action mean nothing." By the time the meeting concluded, Ophelia had not only secured a promise from the airport to implement her recommendations, but had also laid the groundwork for a broader partnership to address bias in the aviation industry. As she left the terminal, she felt a sense of accomplishment, though she knew the real work was just beginning. Back at her office, Ophelia's team had already made progress on their initiatives. Lawrence presented a preliminary outline for the public-private partnership, while Denise reported positive responses from several advocacy groups interested in collaborating. As the day drew to a close, Ophelia sat in her office, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. The incident at the terminal had been a stark reminder of the challenges she continued to face, even at the height of her success. But it had also reinforced her belief in the power of perseverance and the importance of using her platform to effect change. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Patrice, the woman whose earlier email had resonated so deeply. Ms. Harris, I saw the news about your meeting with the airport executives. Thank you for standing up for all of us. You're not just changing policies, you're changing lives. Ophelia's lips curved into a soft smile as she typed her reply. Thank you, Patrice. Together, we can change much more. As she sent the message, a renewed sense of purpose surged within her. The fight for equity and respect was far from over, but Ophelia Harris was ready for whatever came next. The world was watching, and she intended to lead by example, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the days unfolded, the ripple effect of the incident at the airport grew stronger. Ophelia Harris had become a symbol of perseverance and change, not just for her confrontation with prejudice, but for the decisive steps she took afterward. Her public and private initiatives began to take shape, and with each passing day, the scope of her impact widened. The meeting with the airport executives had not only spurred a commitment to systemic reform within their organization, but also inspired other industries to re-evaluate their practices. Letters and emails poured into her office, not just from ordinary people but from CEOs, policymakers, and even celebrities who wanted to lend their voices to her cause. What started as a singular event was quickly evolving into a movement. Ophelia's days were filled with back-to-back meetings, media interviews, and strategy sessions with her team. Despite the whirlwind, she remained grounded, her focus unwavering. She wasn't interested in fleeting headlines or hollow accolades, she was building something lasting. She envisioned a network of advocates and institutions working collectively to dismantle the biases embedded in society's framework. One of her most pivotal meetings occurred 2 weeks after the incident. The setting was a grand ballroom in a historic downtown hotel, where Ophelia had been invited to speak at a national conference on equity and inclusion in business. The audience was a mix of corporate leaders, educators, activists, and policymakers, all eager to hear her address. As she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. Dressed in a deep emerald suit that radiated both authority and elegance, Ophelia took her place at the podium. She paused, letting the applause die down, and surveyed the crowd. The energy in the room was electric, charged with anticipation. Good afternoon, she began, her voice calm but commanding. It's an honor to stand before you today, not as a symbol, but as a voice for change. What happened to me at that airport was not unique. It was a reflection of a system that has, for far too long, marginalized and underestimated people based on their appearance, their background, their gender, and their race. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. But today is not about what happened to me. It's about what we do with moments like these. It's about turning indignation into action and frustration into progress. Each of us in this room has the power to effect change, not just in our organizations but in the lives of those who look to us for leadership. She went on to outline the initiatives her team had been working on, a comprehensive training program that combined bias awareness with actionable strategies for inclusion, a mentorship network to support underrepresented professionals in achieving leadership roles, and a coalition of businesses committed to measurable diversity goals. As leaders, she continued, we must recognize that equity is not a checkbox. It's not a one-time training or a feel-good slogan. It's a commitment, a daily practice of questioning our assumptions, challenging our biases, and holding ourselves accountable. And it starts with acknowledging that we all have work to do. The applause that followed her speech was thunderous, but Ophelia wasn't finished. She opened the floor for questions, encouraging a dialogue rather than a monologue. One by one, audience members stood to ask about the practicalities of implementing her initiatives, the challenges she had faced in her career, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Her answers were candid, laced with both hard-earned wisdom and actionable advice. By the time the session ended, Ophelia had not only inspired the room but had also gained new allies in her mission. Several corporate leaders approached her afterward, expressing their interest in partnering with her organization. One of them, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, even offered to fund the initial rollout of her mentorship network. As she left the conference that evening, Ophelia felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The seeds she had planted were beginning to bear fruit, and the momentum was undeniable. But she also knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Real change required persistence, patience, and an unrelenting commitment to the cause. Back at her estate that night, Ophelia allowed herself a rare moment of solitude. She sat on the terrace, overlooking the sprawling gardens, bathed in moonlight. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine. It was in these quiet moments that she found clarity. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a notification from social media. Curious, she opened the app to find a post that had gone viral. It was a photo of her speaking at the conference, accompanied by the caption, "This is what leadership looks like: grace, strength, and the courage to demand better." The comments were filled with words of encouragement and gratitude. But one in particular caught her eye. It was from the young woman at the airport who had watched her stand firm in the face of adversity. "Ms. Harris, your example changed how I see myself. I spoke up at work today for the first time and my voice was heard. Thank you for showing me that we all have the power to make a difference." Ophelia felt a lump in her throat as she read the words. It was moments like these that reminded her why she fought so hard. It wasn't just about policies or programs, it was about empowering individuals to recognize their worth and their ability to affect change. The following morning, Ophelia's office was abuzz with activity. Lawrence had finalized the proposal for the public-private partnership, and Denise had secured commitments from several advocacy groups to join the initiative. The team was preparing for a major press conference to announce their plans, and the excitement was palpable. As Ophelia reviewed the final details, she thought about how far she had come. From a young woman struggling to break into the logistics industry to a CEO leading a national movement, her journey had been anything but easy. But every challenge, every setback, had shaped her into the leader she was today. When the day of the press conference arrived, the event was held in the same private terminal where the incident had occurred. The symbolism was deliberate, a reclamation of the space that had once been a site of humiliation. This time, the terminal was filled with reporters, cameras, and supporters eager to hear her vision for the future. Ophelia stepped onto the makeshift stage, her heart steady and her resolve unshakable. She began her address with the same calm authority that had carried her through countless boardrooms and stages. "Today," she said, "we take the first step in building a future where respect is not earned but expected, where equity is not an aspiration but a reality. This is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning." As the crowd erupted into applause, Ophelia felt a profound sense of purpose. She had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change, and she knew that the impact of her actions would ripple far beyond this room. For her, the work was never about legacy. It was about ensuring that the world she left behind was better than the one she had inherited. And in that moment, she knew she was on the right path.